Hey class, in today's lesson, you're going to be asking yourselves how do changes in one part of an ecosystem impact another? The objective of today's lesson is to be able to predict how changes in one part of an ecosystem can impact another. There are two parts to this lesson. This is only the first part. Once we are done with this part, the video will continue into the second video. So what is the difference between a food chain and a food web? So you guys have probably heard these terms, but just for clarification, a food chain is one possible path that energy may take as it moves through an ecosystem. So each living thing in an ecosystem is part of multiple food chains, and a food web consists of all the food chains in a single ecosystem. So food chains make up a food web. So what are the components of a food web? You guys have probably gone over this in previous classes, but just to touch on these really quickly, a producer is an organism that can make its own energy from the sun through photosynthesis. A consumer is an organism that must eat other organisms to get energy, and a decomposer gets its energy from dead and decaying matter. So now that we know these definitions, I'm going to display a food web on the next slide. On this next slide, you want to be able to label the producers, so consumers, and decomposers in the food web. So producers, remember, are organisms that make their own energy. Consumers must eat other organisms, and decomposers get its energy from dead and decaying matter. So here you go. Here is the food web. Take a few seconds to try to label your consumers, producers, and decomposers. So if your food web looks like this, your food web is correct with the eagle, the herring gull, the salmon, trout, humans, all these things in red. Those are your consumers, so they must eat other things in order to obtain energy. Whereas producers down here, they produce their own energy, they create their own energy. And decomposers, they get their energy from dead and decaying matter. Okay, so now we want to ask ourselves, how do changes in one part of an ecosystem impact another? So for those who don't know what impact means to influence the effect, an effect or change. So an example of a sentence you could use this in is Carlos' choice to stop staying up late impacted his grades positively. So we want to look at a few examples. What do you think is going to happen to the population size of the small fish? This right here in the pink. If habitat destruction reduces the population size of the herring gull. Right here. So if we look at our arrows and we look at where small fish are, small fish get eaten by herring gull based off of the arrows. They also get eaten by the eagles and salmon and lake trout and so on. But if this population decreases due to habitat destruction, we know that the small fish population will increase because only the eagle and the salmon and lake trout and the snapping turtles are really destroying or taking away from the small fish population. Whereas if the herring gull was still there, we know that our population size would decrease, but we know the herring gull is gone, so our population size of the small fish would increase. So what do you think is going to happen to the eagle if the herring gull population decreases? So we also think the eagle population will probably decrease because the eagles rely on herring gull, small fish, and the salmon and lake trout to eat. There is a possibility that, it might not really differentiate that much because the eagle can eat more of the small fish, more of the salmon and lake trout, but it won't be preying on the herring gull. So what do we think is going to happen to the salmon and lake trout if the eagle population is reduced? If you said the salmon and lake trout population would increase, you are correct. It's because, there's nothing that's eating these things except for humans. So that would increase the population of salmon and lake trout. All right, and what do we think is going to happen to the invertebrate if bacteria and fungi decrease? So invertebrate, they eat bacteria and fungi. So because of that, we would say that invertebrate population would decrease. Then what will happen to the amount of vegetation if the duck population increases? So if we have more ducks, we know Ducks, they eat vegetation, so our vegetation would decrease. Oops. And then what will happen to the number of eagles in an area if the salmon and lake trout population increases? We know eagles would probably stay the same or would increase because there's more food for them to eat, but it really wouldn't change that much. And then what would happen to the small fish population if the salmon and lake trout population increased? We know small fish would decrease because there's more salmon and lake trout preying on the small fish. So great, we've made it on to our next lesson. Our objective for this lesson is to explain the global impact of loss of biodiversity, and we want to ask ourselves, why is biodiversity important to the biosphere? So what is sustainability? You guys might have heard this term before, but just so you know, sustainability refers to everything we need for our survival and well-being. Well, it kind of depends directly or indirectly on our natural environment. So our environment relies a lot on we rely a lot on what we need for survival on our natural environment. So sustainability means that we are meeting the current and future needs of a population without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So that means we're using things, we're not quite using it up. There's still enough for other generations to use, and we're making sure that we're conscious of that. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity, we know bio means living. So based off of that, we know that biodiversity is the sum total of the variety of organisms in the biosphere. So we know biodiversity is important because it increases the sustainability of ecosystems. So sustainability is important to have because we need to make sure that we continue to have water, materials, and resources in order to protect human health in our environment. Because if we don't, then we run out of things, and biodiversity also gets harmed in turn. So a variety of species, when we have significant amounts of biodiversity or large amounts of biodiversity, it's beneficial to humans for things like medicine, food, resources. But when biodiversity is lost, our resources that are valuable to our biosphere and to humankind may be lost with it. So we want to ask ourselves, how do humans decrease biodiversity? So human activities that can reduce biodiversity are known as the Hippo dilemma. So there are 5 that we'll talk about. HIPPO. So the first is habitat loss. Second is introducing invasive or foreign species to new environments. So what happens when you introduce invasive species to new environments is that they take over these environments and they harm the existing biodiversity that was previously there. Population growth. So we know when there are too many people, that also reduces the amount of resources that we have, and in turn biodiversity and sustainability. Pollution. We know pollution can harm a lot of ecosystems and habitats, therefore also decreasing our biodiversity and sustainability. And lastly, overconsumption. If we use too much water, if we eat too much food, if we have too much waste, all these things harm biodiversity. So it's very important that we are conscious of how much we are using, because eventually we're going to use it all up. These resources don't replenish each other as quickly as we think they might. So now that you've finished this lesson, make sure that you complete the independent practice on changes in the ecosystem in our exit ticket. That's it, everyone. Bye.